Hello, science class. This is our last chapter, chapter 15. So I'm going to go over some of these terms that we see here. Once again, we have a lot of terms, and some of these might be a little bit newer. So I'm going to spend some time on some of the key terms and review some of the last little bits of chapter 15. The big thing, or the big kind of idea behind chapter 15 is how we need to be responsible in our world. How do we be good stewards to keep the earth healthy? And how do we learn from some of the mistakes that we've done in the past? And what were those mistakes? And then how do we try to keep mistakes from popping up again? And how do we fix some of the things when we need to do certain things like drilling or mining in the world? And then how do we fix it and restore it back to natural? And we're going to talk about some of these things. The first terms that we're going to come up against are the biodegradable and non-biodegradable. And that's what we see right here. These are the first few terms. This is right at the very start of the chapter. These terms are talking about, does it break down in the environment naturally, or does it just stick around and never break down? And so biodegradable would be something like composting or anything that you would put into the green bin, any kind of food waste that will actually break down and decompose. Non-biodegradable is going to be something where it doesn't actually break down and it takes a very, very long time to actually break down, like thousands upon thousands of years if it was to actually break down. Something like plastics. They don't just break down. If you litter and you throw out that garbage, it's just going to stay that way. It might break into smaller pieces, but it's not getting broken down, getting recycled into the environment. So we're learning about these first two terms. And it's a good principle to live by, and knowing when do we need to throw garbage out and make sure it just doesn't spread and get into the other environment, or is something biodegradable and actually usable again as something like compost. Our next issue comes up with is this DDT, and you can see how I've written it out. I had to write it real small. This dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane. It's a chemical compound, and we just usually call it DDT, so we don't have to keep saying it over and over. What happens though is this was initially a pesticide, and a pesticide is just something that kills insects, because when we have crops and we started to have agriculture, we don't want this kind of pest right here eating all of our crops. We don't want it to destroy all the food that we're trying to grow. And when we grow food, we're giving them a larger food supply, and then they get more and more. This DDT was used to kill all these insects. The troubling part is it also enters the food chain, and it enters into this web of food, and it becomes very, very dangerous in higher and higher concentrations. So at the small little level, this little species might die from it, but it enters in the environment in other ways too, through small little microorganisms like we see here. Other little seeds or bacteria might eat it here, and it might go into the other algae. And then you can see this fish gets more and more of it because it eats lots of this algae or this other food, and it gets a higher concentration. And then this next fish eats more of those smaller fish, and because it's concentrated here, it becomes even more concentrated here, and it gets bigger and bigger. And then when this eagle eats one or two of these fish, the concentration becomes so much more. They call this biological magnification, or just biomagnification. It's magnifying, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger the higher up a food chain you go. And that's very dangerous with these insecticides, where it's meant to kill insects, but it enters the environment and it causes harmful effects down the road. This can also be said about herbicides, or whenever we see that side ending, and I'm going to scroll back up like we see here, this side ending, pests, pesticides, it kills pests. Insecticide, it kills insects. Herbicide, it kills herbs or plants. So these sides means to kill, and it's targeting it to kill them. This next image is talking about how nitrogen or fertilizers enter into the ecosystem when there's too much of them. We used to use fertilizers because when we're growing crops over and over on the land, we want them to grow as big as possible. And when we grow them as big as possible, we need fertilizers because they're using the nutrients. However, if we use too much and there's just excess, it starts at the farm, but then it goes into the water system like we see here. The fertilizers help all plants grow, which seems good because then all the aquatic life grows very quickly and all these water plants grow very, very quickly. However, these deep water plants now cannot get sunlight, and when they die, they stop producing oxygen for the water. And when the plants die, the decomposers have lots of food, and the population of the decomposers rapidly increases. And so they use up all the oxygen there. And when they use up all the oxygen, soon the animals living in the water cannot actually survive in the water, and it causes a lot of death within those animals. And so by having plants grow really fast, blocking out the sun, it causes a cascade effect of things dying and dying, using up all the oxygen, and then the larger animals will be dying as well. And so that's the dangerous part. This word is called eutrophication. And so it's where we have excess fertilizer and it causes almost like a pollutant and it causes water systems to have their natural animals and organisms living in there to die off because they bloom so fast, and then with a rapid increase in life there's a rapid increase in their death as well. So this eutrophication is not a good thing. So we talked about producing more food and the dangerous parts about producing food where we use too many insecticides, too many fertilizers. How do we also produce more energy? Because we produce more food, we also need to produce more energy. First, I want to talk quickly about how do we get energy. And in Alberta, we burn a lot of coal as our primary electricity source. And so we see here, 100 million years, 500 million years ago, Alberta looked very tropical, had lots and lots of plants. These plants got covered up with something, died out, and you can see they got buried kind of right in this layer and they got trapped there. And so as it kind of got buried, as they built up there, and you can see here, you can get compressed and get this coal layer all compressed in, and it gets compacted as it gets covered up. More and more coal gets buried deeper, and through time, heat, and pressure, we start to form coal. And so that's how coal is formed, depending on the rock layers. If oil and gas get trapped under there, that's how we get our fossil fuels. They're trapped away from old fossils of old living things. This is great because, well, we get lots of electricity. However, the downside to burning fossil fuels is they give off CO2, H2O, they give off unburnt carbons and other products. We're going to come across this term, the greenhouse effect. And a lot of people, when they hear the greenhouse effect, think of it as a bad thing. Well, it's not. The greenhouse effect is needed so we can actually heat our Earth. Without the greenhouse effect, it would be too cold on Earth to actually live. So we need the greenhouse effect to have warm enough temperatures so we can actually live on it. So what happens is sun's radiation comes in. Sometimes it's bounced off through clouds. Sometimes other types of radiation come in and bounce off, like some UV radiation or some gamma radiation. They come in and it bounces off because of our ozone. We'll talk more about that. But light is able to pass through, hits the Earth's surface, and when it hits the Earth's surface, some of it escapes back into space. Some of it bounces in, hits clouds, bounces back, hits clouds, bounces in, and it creates this little heat pocket. These greenhouse gases trap the heat on Earth. So it's a good thing because having CO2 and water or H2O in our atmosphere helps keep our planet warm, which is a good thing. However, the bad part about it is when we're burning fossil fuels and when we're actually trying to not have this greenhouse effect come naturally, we have a human enhanced greenhouse effect. And this is the bad side of it. And this is what is the link to global warming. And the thought behind it all is that we are producing excess CO2 through burning fossil fuels. We're producing excess methane, that's CH4. We have this N2O, so these are the other products that are being formed, and they are trapping more and more heat. And so we are making the greenhouse effect work more, heating up our planet. So that is the bad side about all these fossil fuels is they produce this CO2 and they produce excess greenhouse gases, causing this effect to be magnified and get worse and worse. And so this is the downside of the greenhouse effect is we're making it more powerful. We're adding more greenhouse gases, causing us to have a warmer climate. And so greenhouse effect, not a bad thing. Having it enhanced by human pollution, that is the bad thing. And that's what global leaders now are trying to reduce carbon emissions so we're not just producing, and we're aware that we're doing this and we're trying to fix this problem right now. Another thing we're talking about that has been fixed is this. CFCs. And I talked about the ozone layer and how it reflects some different types of energy coming in from the sun because the sun just doesn't give us light energy. That's the energy we see, but it also gives us microwaves, it gives us radio waves, it gives us X-rays, UV rays, and it gives us all these different types of rays. Our ozone layer and different layers of our atmosphere block out a lot of that. So it lets light through and it lets some infrared through and some UV light through. However, it blocks out a lot of it. The hard part is that this thing called CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons, they were used in refrigerants and we've used them in the past back in the mid 1900s and we used them a lot. However, we didn't know what their effects were because they were so stable and everyone thought they were perfect because they didn't really react with anything until they got to the ozone layer in the atmosphere, and that's where they reacted, and they actually start to break apart the ozone, causing holes in this ozone layer, which means now stronger UV radiation can come through, X-rays can come through, and that leads us to a lot of damaging effects because having this excess UV radiation and X-ray radiation causes mutations in our cells. And so it just mutates all these different cells because it's too powerful of energy for us to actually use. So that's why our ozone layer is there and why it's so important. So if you've ever heard of CFCs and why they're damaging, that's because they break down the ozone layer. Lastly, now that we're moving away from our environment, or moving away from our atmosphere rather, we're talking about how we deal with trash on the land. And here we have landfills, and how does a landfill generally work? And what happens is we have solid waste and we have plastic liners. So when you go to a landfill, it's essentially like you're adding all your garbage to one giant plastic garbage bag, and we're trapping it in there and keeping it safe. So all the juices and all the excess things that you break down from all of it doesn't enter the atmosphere or enter the water systems and enter the earth. And so that's why we have these pipes and pumps is to suck up any kind of juices because it's still open at the top, it's covered with soil and everything, except there is juices and water that runs through, but they try to catch it so it doesn't enter into the environment. What happens though is once it's recycled, and I have this picture, essentially this will be the new landfill, where they have the landfill with tons and tons of garbage. They put recycled loam on top and they put compost and mulch, and then they build a forest on top. BP has one of these forests, and they have several of them in Calgary. There are these reclamation and these recovery forests, And it's an example of, okay, we produce this waste and we are going to produce waste, but how do we deal with it positively? So once the landfill is done and it's full, they turn it back into a wildlife and a water system where they can monitor and make sure that it can turn back into a wildlife sanctuary where people can go walk, animals can use it, and it becomes a place or an attractive place to actually visit. So one such example is Elliston Park is one of these BP birthplace forests where these oil companies are putting money back into the environment to reclaim the way it was. And so that's what reclamation is reclaiming how it was. Big part about this is what can we do as humans actually help the environment, because we know we're going to cause some problems, but what can we do to actually fix them? So some plans were reduce, reuse, recycle. We've heard that before. Reduce your waste, reuse anything that you need to, and recycle when possible. And so that's why we're getting rid of plastic bags, because they're kind of that one-time use thing. So reuse those reusable bags, those cloth bags. Reduce how much you need to actually use bags by just, or reduce kind of things by making sure you're not using them, and then recycle when possible. And all these ideas are key. And with the chapter 15, be familiar with some of these problems, and then what are some of the ways we can actually try to help solve these issues. And so we're not just causing them, how can we actually solve them? So that's it for chapter 15. I just want to make sure we go up here. We've talked about all these terms and things we just need to be familiar with and how we need to restore everything, or at least think of ways we can restore our environment so it's available for future generations. Perfect. Take time. This is a unit test coming up, so please make sure to take your time, study all the chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15. Good luck on it. And then after the unit test, please make sure you have a passing grade, and if anything else needs to be handed in, make sure to do that. Take care and have a great summer, everyone.